Hi, my name is Trey Bechtold, and I am here today to talk to you about how to do a research paper. Uh, it is important when you're beginning a research paper or any type of paper that you turn in to look carefully over the instructions that you are given. Look at your syllabus. Look over the assignment sheet you're given. Look at exactly what it is the instructor is expecting you to turn in. If he asks for a book review, a 2 to 3 page book review, then you won't want to do a research paper to do a book review. If he's asking for a research paper in which you identify a problem, uh, define a thesis, support your thesis with argument, then of course you're going to do a lot more work. So look at the instructions you're given. Look over the expectations of the paper. If there's a rubric, look over that. Look at what the instructor is going to be looking at to grade your paper. If he has special instructions such as a separate section in which you apply what you have learned in a ministry setting, make sure you include that when you turn in your paper, or else you will have points taken off. Look over any of the minimum requirements he gives you. For instance, if your instructor says you need to have at least 5 sources in your paper, then you need to make sure that you are including at least 5 sources in your paper. Now, also keep in mind that minimum requirements are just that. They're minimum requirements. If you do the minimum on a paper, you can expect to pass the paper maybe, but don't expect that you will get an A on a paper if you're doing just the minimum. So if the minimum requirements are 5 sources, 8 pages in which you identify one problem and you support it with 3 arguments, if you do just that, then you are doing just enough to pass. So make sure that you are, if you are wanting an A on the paper, that you go above and beyond the minimum requirements. The minimum just means what it takes to pass, not what it takes to make an A. If you have any questions at all over the expectations that your instructor has for a paper, if the instructions he gives you are not necessarily clear, please communicate with your instructor before you turn in your paper. A week after you've turned in your paper, after you've gotten your grade back, is not the time to say, well, I didn't understand the assignment. If you don't understand the assignment, you need to make sure you get with your instructor before you turn in the paper so that you can make it clear. It is your responsibility to meet the expectations the instructor has, and if you're not clear on what those are, please let him know. Now I want to talk about sources. What sources are appropriate to use in a paper, where to find sources, and what sources not to use in a paper, and also how to use sources. How do I utilize them in my research and in building an argument? First of all, the type of sources you want to use for your research paper are going to depend very much on the type of paper it is. If this is a paper in which you are to take statistical data and analyze it, then of course the sources you use are going to be different than a paper that asks you to, for instance, interpret a chapter or a verse in the Bible. A research paper that asks you to interact with popular culture in a certain way, a movie, book review, things like that. Those sources that you use for that are going to be completely different than one that asks you to analyze an argument in support of a theological position or specific conclusion based on a passage of Scripture. So, first stage of choosing sources and using them is to understand the type of paper you're doing. And if you have any questions on that, ask your instructor. Again, understand the type of paper you're doing first before you start doing it. But as far as generally what types of sources are appropriate, if you're doing an academic research paper, you're going to want to use sources that are academic scholarly in nature. These are sources that are written generally written to an academic community, generally written from an academic perspective in which they argue a case, they support it with evidence. Many times they'll provide footnotes. Things like Bible studies are not academic. They're used more as devotional material. So look at the source carefully. Kind of look at the audience it's geared towards. If it's geared towards a popular audience that's really not arguing a case, not interacting with other arguments or other scholars, it might be a good idea to avoid that. But again, it's going to depend on the source, and it's going to depend on the type of paper you're doing. Generally, what sources are not appropriate for an academic research paper would be Bible studies material, study Bibles, for instance, the NIV Study Bible, the ESV Study Bible. Those types of study Bibles are good for devotionals, but not for academic research. You want to avoid generally websites that, for instance, blogs, uh, sources of that type. Websites are good for giving general information, but they are more opinion based than anything else. If your paper is to examine specific blog entries, then of course websites would be appropriate. But for general research paper, avoid websites if at all possible. Wikipedia is not an appropriate academic source. Wikipedia is open source. Anyone can post to it, so the source doesn't necessarily have to be correct. In fact, I have read instances of people purposely changing Wikipedia articles to give misinformation and disinformation. So unless your paper is on Wikipedia, do not use Wikipedia or sources like it. Online dictionaries, online encyclopedias, generally those are not appropriate for academic research. Merriam-Webster dictionary is another example of something you would not use as a source or cite as an academic source. You should use a dictionary. You should use it to check your spelling, to check a meaning of a word, but you would not use it as a source. You wouldn't cite it as a scholarly resource and count it towards a source on a paper. Also, sources like the Encyclopedia Britannica, they're good for giving a general overview of a topic, but not at this level. You want to go beyond that in the research you're doing. A good way to find sources to use, and I do this at the beginning of all my papers. Find a couple of sources, a good commentary, Word Biblical Commentary is a good scholarly source, and look at the bibliography that's provided in there. Bible dictionaries, a good Bible dictionary will have a bibliography section at the beginning or end of each entry, and you can look at those sources. Go to those sources. Look at the sources people are using. Mine them for treasure. Follow the same trails that other scholars are following. Look at those bibliographies of the sources you go, of the sources you find, and dig through theirs. If one source keeps coming up over and over and over again, use that source because it seems to be an important source. But make sure that you are carefully looking at sources. Don't just pick one or two out and say this is sufficient. Broaden your field of research. And as you're interacting with these sources, make sure you are interacting with them. Just because a source says something doesn't mean it's true. You need to make sure that you are critically examining the sources. If they argue a case that is wrong, it's okay to say John Smith argues this, but he's wrong because of this and this and this. So just because a source says something doesn't mean they're right. You need to critically use your sources in your research. Think about what they say, weigh the strengths and weaknesses of their arguments, and make sure that you use them correctly and adequately. Just citing a source as proof for an argument doesn't necessarily prove your argument. The source could be wrong. So look at them carefully, and again, if you have any questions on whether a source is appropriate, ask your instructor.